The rising twin suns of Sci-Fi cast elongated shadows through the dome-shaped glass of the containment facility as the cadets of the Galactic Zoology Academy filed in, their polished uniforms glinting under the artificial daylight. The facility was designed to withstand the fury of creatures twice the size of a hovercraft, with reinforced gravsteel walls, biometric panic locks, and force field projectors lining the perimeter. This was not a test for the faint-hearted. Today's final exam was unlike any before. It involved the Academy's most volatile life form, a full-grown male Gorvath. Native to the toxic swamps of Trelaxis 7, this creature had previously torn through a Type 6 exploration mech like it was made of paper. With tusks the length of a cadet's torso and eyes that glowed faintly crimson in low light, the Gorvath was known not only for its brute strength, but for its extreme sensitivity to environmental stimuli. Slight changes in tone or temperature could trigger unpredictable reactions, ranging from apathy to berserker rage. Professor Elrix, a four-eyed instructor from the Drolum sector with a reputation for unshakable composure, floated above the students on a levitation disc. His mouth tendrils twitched in anticipation as he projected the creature's vital stats onto the transparent dome. Today, he announced in a low, modulated tone, "You will attempt what few have survived, behavioral engagement with a wild-born Gorvath. The objective is not subjugation, but de-escalation. Calm it, approach it, show us understanding, not dominance." Cadets whispered among themselves, some tightening the seals on their suits, others double-checking the programming of their neural pacifiers. There were 12 students in total, from 10 different planetary systems, each trained in unique methods of xenocommunication. Among them stood the only human in the group, Cadet Jonah Blake. He kept a modest distance from the others, his expression unreadable. He wore no haptic gloves, no helmet, and carried nothing but a small leather notebook tucked into his sleeve. His uniform was regulation, but slightly worn, and his boots bore dust from actual ground, not simulation gravel. Some of the alien cadets had mocked his lack of tech during prior exercises, but Jonah never responded. He preferred observation over confrontation. The inner containment gate hissed open, revealing the Gorvath. The room dropped several degrees as the creature stepped in. Its hide was thick and slate gray, with patches of moss and dried mud clinging to its ridged shoulders. Each footfall echoed like a hammer striking stone. The Gorvath's nostrils flared, tasting the air. Its breathing was slow but heavy, and its long, spined tail dragged across the floor behind it like a threat etched into the metal. Even from the viewing deck, Jonah could sense the shift in atmosphere. One wrong move from any cadet would provoke a deadly reaction. Professor Elrix gestured to the first volunteer. A crystalline being named Toll floated forward, shimmering with nervous light. Toll initiated his approach with soft harmonic pulses meant to mimic the resonance of the Gorvath's native swamplands. The sound bounced harmlessly off the beast's thick skull. It blinked, tilted its head, and then let out a guttural growl. Toll quickly retreated, his vibrations flickering in panic. Next came Vraska, a tall, antlered student from Cernathi Prime, who activated a camouflage field to match the color spectrum the Gorvath saw in. She inched forward, blending in perfectly with the room's background, until the Gorvath's eyes focused sharply on the distortion in space and charged. Vraska barely escaped behind the force field as the beast slammed into it, roaring loud enough to rattle the overhead girders. Student after student attempted techniques: mental projection, glandular scent release, food offering via drones, but nothing worked. The Gorvath grew increasingly agitated. It began pacing in circles, its tail whipping behind it, creating dents in the floor panels. The creature exhaled in long, rhythmic bursts, signaling rising distress. Jonah watched it all unfold without saying a word. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the beast. He wasn't reading the data on the wall panels like the others. He was watching the Gorvath's muscles, its breathing, the way its ears twitched when startled by noise. He noted how its shoulders hunched when drones got too close, how it seemed to turn its head slightly toward warmth. But mostly, he watched its eyes. Not the color or size, those were well documented, but the emotion behind them. Professor Eldrix frowned and signaled the exam's final phase. "We are nearing critical agitation levels," he warned. One last attempt before sedation protocols begin. He glanced at Jonah, as if offering him the last word before the test was declared a failure. Jonah didn't move at first. He waited until the Gorvoth stopped its pacing and stood still at the center of the dome, breathing heavily, but no longer roaring. That's when he took a step forward. The room went quiet. He walked slowly, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the floor. He held his hands low and open, keeping his posture non-threatening. The alien cadets looked on with disbelief. No shield, no sonic barrier, no neurohelm, just a human walking straight into the danger zone. Professor Elrics whispered something into his comlink, preparing emergency lockdown just in case. Jonah stopped about 10 meters from the Gorvath and crouched. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He simply sat there, watching. The Gorvath's ears twitched, but it didn't move. Its eyes locked with Jonah's. Seconds passed, then minutes. Jonah slowly removed one glove and placed his bare hand on the floor. He tapped it lightly, then dragged it in a short line. He repeated the motion, mimicking the movement pattern of a submissive creature. The Gorvath tilted its head. Its tail stopped twitching. Jonah stayed still. Then, barely noticeable, he started talking. Not in galactic standard, but in English. Not because he thought the beast would understand the words, but because of the tone. It was calm, low, and rhythmic, the kind of voice used to soothe scared animals. His fingers moved gently in the air, tracing arcs that matched the creature's breathing. He didn't command, he invited. From the deck, Professor Elrics watched through narrowed eyes. He leaned toward the screen and zoomed in. "Fascinating," he muttered. "No aggression, no technology, just intuition." Jonah didn't move further. He waited. The Gorvath blinked, then took one step forward. Its claws scraped the floor, but its body didn't tense. Jonah shifted his weight slightly, but stayed crouched. He reached his hand out. Slowly, palm up, the Gorvath lowered its massive head slightly, nostrils flaring again. Then it said, "No one breathed," and Jonah smiled. Just a little. The exam wasn't over. But the dome, for the first time in 2 hours, was quiet, peaceful. The beast had not been tamed, but it had been seen. And in that moment, Jonah knew more about connection than all the textbooks combined. Jonah remained crouched for what felt like an eternity, his hand resting motionless in the air between him and the Gorvath. The creature's massive eyes remained locked onto his, and though the tension in the air had lessened, there was still a raw unpredictability behind the beast's gaze. Jonah could hear nothing but the creature's breathing and the faint hum of the containment dome's force field behind him. Every muscle in his body was alert, but none of them trembled. His presence was calm, but his instincts were honed razor-sharp. Then the Gorvath leaned forward, sniffed his hand and, unexpectedly, nudged it gently with the edge of its snout. Its skin was coarse and warm, textured like tree bark left in a swamp. Jonah didn't flinch. Instead, he let his fingers curl slightly, brushing under the creature's jaw in the same motion he once used to calm aggressive dogs back on Earth. The Gorvath blinked slowly and let out a low vibration through its throat, not unlike a purr, though much deeper, almost seismic. From the observation deck above, students and faculty alike leaned in toward the glass. Professor Elrics said nothing. His arms were folded tightly across his chest, and his expression remained unreadable. The other cadets exchanged stunned glances, none more surprised than Vraska, whose antlered head had previously shaken in amusement at Jonah's barehanded approach. Jonah slowly stood, maintaining his proximity without any sudden movements. The Gorvath rose with him, stretching its limbs slightly and yawning, revealing fangs as long as his forearm. The moment could have turned dangerous, but Jonah didn't retreat. He simply took a half step back and turned sideways, not away from the beast, but just enough to indicate he was not a threat. The Gorvath flicked its tail once, then slowly lay down on its haunches and rested its head on its front paws. The voice of Professor Elrics crackled through the overhead speakers, cold and deliberate. "Containment remains stable. Subject is exhibiting passive behavior. Cadet Blake returned to the boundary zone." Jonah gave a slight nod and backed away slowly until he reached the marked perimeter. As soon as he crossed the designated line, a translucent energy field shimmered into place, resetting the barrier between student and subject. Only once the shield hummed steadily again did Jonah turn his back on the Gorvoth and walk toward the debriefing chamber. As he entered the adjacent corridor, his path intersected with several of the other cadets, all making their way down from the observation deck. Some looked at him with astonishment, others with poorly masked irritation. Tal shimmered in uncertain patterns, as though trying to communicate approval while simultaneously processing defeat. Vraska narrowed her golden eyes as she approached him. "What did you do?" she asked, not accusatory but genuinely baffled. Her tone lacked the usual edge she reserved for him. Jonah adjusted the strap on his sleeve and kept walking. "I paid attention." Vraska clicked her tongue and shook her head. "That's not how those creatures react. You didn't use any pheromone cues or neural imprint. There must have been something else." "I scratched him behind the jaw," Jonah replied simply, opening the door to the debriefing room. That's what he needed. Inside, the atmosphere was far more formal. The faculty sat behind a long semicircular table made of dark senthe wood. Each instructor represented a different planetary alliance and brought with him centuries of accumulated xenobehavioral knowledge. Above them, a projection of the encounter played on a suspended screen. The moment where the Gorvoth allowed contact was frozen in still frame. Professor Elric sat in the center. His gaze pierced through Jonah as he entered, but his voice remained calm. "We have reviewed your performance in real time, Cadet Blake. Before we make any evaluations, you will explain your methodology. Speak clearly." Jonah stood in the center of the room, hands behind his back. The Gorvoth wasn't acting aggressively because he was violent. He was overwhelmed. Every approach before mine triggered his defensive instincts. Noise, light, invisible energy waves, it was all pressure. He didn't know what any of you wanted from him. A shorter faculty member, Professor Helan from the Arixis system, interjected with a buzz from his tri-jawed mouth. "And your method?" Jonah nodded. "I gave him space, then I made myself small and slow," I observed. He wasn't looking for a challenge, he was looking for familiarity, comfort. I gave him both. Another instructor, Professor Drell from the Regari Belt, tilted his head. "You claim to have recognized emotional cues through visual observation alone?" "Yes," Jonah answered. "It's something humans do all the time, with dogs, horses, even with other people. Body language is universal. The Gorvoth wasn't unpredictable, he was consistent. You just weren't reading the right signals." Professor Elric tapped his claw against the table. "Cadet, this was a test designed to push technological and cognitive boundaries. Not to pet wild creatures like domestic animals." "I know," Jonah said, "but you asked us to calm him. I didn't use tech because that's not what he needed." There was silence for several seconds. Professor Eldrix finally stood. "Your actions were unconventional, but effective. The creature displayed a complete behavioral shift without the use of any equipment. This has never occurred in recorded history." Jonah stayed quiet. Elrix turned to the others. "The Academy will issue its final results after full analysis. For now, you are dismissed." Jonah gave a curt nod and exited the room. The hallway outside was quiet, lit only by the bioluminescent strips woven into the walls. He walked toward the dorm wing without any urgency. Behind him, the buzz of debate echoed faintly through the walls as the instructors discussed his actions. He didn't need to hear the words. He knew what they were questioning. And he also knew that sometimes the truth was simple, even if no one wanted to believe it. When he reached his room, he stepped inside, removed his boots, and sank into the desk chair. He took out the notebook from his sleeve and flipped to a half-filled page. Among rough sketches of the Gorvoth and scribbled notes about behavioral cycles, he added one more line, scratched under jaw, responded like bear, maybe species-wide. "Monitor." He put the pen down and leaned back, eyes closed, letting his muscles relax for the first time since the morning. Outside, the suns of Sur-5 dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the Academy's towering domes. The day's test had ended, the implications had only begun, and Jonah, alone in a room filled with silence and old paper, understood something the rest of the galaxy had missed. You don't always need power to reach a creature's heart, just presence, patience, and the right touch in the right place. The following morning arrived with little ceremony. A soft blue fog curled around the dormitory towers of the Galactic Zoology Academy, diffused through translucent ventilation shafts that hummed with a steady mechanical rhythm. Jonah rose before the Academy's internal chimes began their morning cycle. His body still carried a dull ache in his back from crouching so long inside the dome the previous day, but his mind was alert. He dressed in silence, pulling on his standard-issue cadet gear, the fabric worn smooth at the elbows and knees from repeated use. He didn't bother checking the communal schedule or the bulletin boards glowing beside the lifts. He already knew he would be summoned. The corridor outside was quiet. Not deserted, some cadets had already begun their rotation toward the lower research tiers, but quiet in the particular way that follows disruption. Jonah passed two instructors who paused mid-conversation as he approached. Neither spoke. One of them, Professor Drell, made a motion as if to call out but hesitated. Jonah nodded politely and continued walking. As he reached the main elevator that led to the briefing level, a low chime sounded through his wristband. It was a summons from Professor Elrix, marked urgent but with no details. He pressed his thumb to the crystal face of the band and stepped into the lift. The ride down was short, but the silence inside the capsule made it feel longer. He could feel it in his bones. Something had shifted since yesterday's encounter. When the doors opened, he stepped into the grand analysis chamber. The room had been redesigned overnight. Instead of its usual configuration of tiered seats and central holographic displays, the space had been rearranged into a circular forum. All faculty were present, seated in a wide arc with Professor Elrix at the center. At the far end of the room stood the projection wall, currently lit with looping footage of the Gravath lying peacefully inside the containment dome. Jonah's silhouette was visible beside the creature, motionless in that now famous crouch. Elrix rose as Jonah approached. "Cadet Blake," he said in a neutral tone, "we have asked you here for observation and possible participation. Please stand in the center." Jonah obeyed without question. The circle of instructors felt tighter than it was. Some watched him with curiosity, others with open skepticism. Professor Helaan adjusted the translation device slotted behind his gill flaps and spoke first. "Since yesterday's event, the Gorvath has not resumed normal aggressive behavior. Not once. It responds only when the human cadet is visible through the viewing panel." Professor Elrix nodded and continued. "This phenomenon presents a challenge. Your interaction appears to have disrupted the subject's behavioral norms. It no longer reacts to deterrent pulses or simulation models. It ignores artificial scent lures and neural mirror displays. It is awaiting you." Jonah said nothing. He waited. "We are organizing a second live session," Elrix said, "this time with stricter constraints. You will be monitored at a molecular level. All physical interactions will be recorded in micro-detail. We need to understand the precise triggers of the subject's transformation. You will follow our guidance precisely." Jonah gave a single nod. "Understood." Professor Drell leaned forward. "Do you believe the Gorvath has formed a bond with you?" "I don't know," Jonah answered, "but he recognizes my presence. That's clear." Professor Elrix gestured toward the exit. "You'll proceed now to the chamber. Suiting is optional. We leave that to your discretion." Jonah turned and left the chamber without hesitation. The walk to the containment wing was brisk. He stopped once at the supply station, scanned his ID at the access locker, and retrieved a single palm-sized device, a basic kinetic monitor. He strapped it to his wrist and left the rest of the equipment untouched. No suit, no helmet, no field regulator, only observation tools. Then he passed through the sterilization mist and entered the outer staging bay. The door to the observation dome hissed open as he approached. Inside, the environment had been subtly altered. The lighting was lower, simulating the Gorvath's native dusk cycle. The floor had been restructured into soft, layered platforms of damp material that resembled the swamp terrain the creature preferred. Standing at the far end of the dome, back turned, was the beast itself. Jonah stepped through the field and into the dome without hesitation. The Gorvath stirred at once. It didn't growl. It didn't rise in aggression. Instead, it turned its enormous head toward him, its eyes narrowing briefly before widening. It let out a low, chuffing sound and took 3 slow steps forward. Jonah walked until he was a few meters away, then stopped. He didn't crouch this time. Instead, he raised one hand slowly, letting the creature see him fully. The Gorvath lowered its head and stretched its neck toward him, closing the distance without hesitation. Jonah reached out and touched the same spot as the day before, just beneath the bony ridge of the creature's jaw. He began to scratch gently, his fingers moving in small, circular motions. The Gorvath let out a guttural exhale, its massive shoulders relaxing visibly. Then it lay down completely at his feet. A sudden surge of whispers echoed from the comm line embedded in the dome's ceiling. Jonah ignored them. He knew they were watching, recording every twitch of his hand, every breath of the creature, every dilation of its pupils. After several minutes, the voice of Professor Elrics came through the intercom, sharp and measured. "Begin auditory prompts." Jonah remained still. In the distance, soft harmonic pulses began to play, tones meant to replicate environmental sounds from the Gorvath's planet. The creature flinched, not violently but with noticeable discomfort. Jonah paused, his hand and waited. When the pulses faded, the Gorvath turned its head and pushed its nose gently into Jonah's knee. The intercom sounded again. "Initiate temperature modulation." Heat radiated from panels in the walls, simulating the rising temperatures of midday Trelax 7. The Gorvath's breathing quickened. Jonah observed the change, saw how the creature's claws dug slightly into the floor. He moved his hand to the base of the creature's neck and pressed lightly. The Gorvath slowed its breathing. Elric's voice returned, this time with a hint of tension. "Disengage stimuli. Proceed with physical disengagement." Jonah stopped his touch entirely and stepped back. The Gorvath followed him, not aggressively, but with clear desire to maintain contact. Jonah held up his hand, signaling for the creature to stay. It halted, watching him with eyes that now seemed almost reflective. The observation team remained silent. Jonah returned to the containment gate, stepped out, and let the field close behind him. He stood in the staging corridor for a moment, wiping his palms on his uniform. The kinetic monitor on his wrist blinked green, indicating a full data capture. Moments later, Professor Elrics arrived, flanked by 2 aides and Professor Heloin. Elrics studied Jonah's expression before speaking. "It appears that your presence now functions as a behavioral stabilizer. This creates unique implications." Jonah met his eyes. "You didn't ask him what he needed. You kept changing his environment, trying to control his response. He doesn't want control, he wants consistency." Professor Helon muttered something into his recorder. Elrics exhaled through his nose slits. "You are not wrong. But science requires replication, understanding, structure." "Then start by listening," Jonah said quietly, "not just observing, listening." Elrics didn't respond. He turned and walked back down the hall, his aides close behind. Jonah stood alone in the corridor for a long time after they left. The weight of what had just occurred pressed against his thoughts. Not because of fear or pride, but because he realized something deeper than he expected. The Gorvath wasn't an anomaly. He was a mirror, and everyone else had been too distracted by their tools to see the reflection staring back at them. Jonah walked out of the containment corridor and into the West Wing without stopping by the cadet dorms. His legs moved steadily, but his mind churned beneath the surface like storm currents under still water. Every moment he had spent with the Gorvath had peeled away another layer of assumption. His, the faculty's, the entire academy's. What began as an exam had evolved into something that none of the instructors were prepared to name yet. Not bonding, not dominance, not even empathy in the traditional scientific sense. It was a dialogue between instincts, and it was one that could not be measured by metrics alone. The analysis from the second session was being processed in real time, fed into simulation models by the Academy's central system. Jonah's movements, breathing patterns, tone shifts, micro-gestures, everything had been logged. But what machines couldn't log was what had passed between him and the creature when their eyes met. That intangible current, that non-verbal recognition. He reached the edge of the West Gardens, a quiet space typically reserved for meditation or rest. The artificial sky above rippled with a peach-orange hue, simulating the last hour of twilight. Jonah sat down beneath a towering ribbon-fronded tree and let the weight of silence settle over him. His hands itched to reach for the notebook again, to scribble down details and cross-reference behavior with earth mammals, but for the first time in days, he didn't move. He simply let his back rest against the smooth bark and allowed himself to breathe. Moments later, the stillness was broken by footsteps approaching from the gravel path. Vraska came into view, her antlers catching the low light like polished obsidian. She stopped a few paces from him, arms folded. "Is it true?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than usual, without the usual bite. Jonah looked up at her. "Is what true? That the Gorvoth followed you to the barrier, even after you left the interaction zone, and stayed there for hours?" He nodded. "He did." Vraska shifted her weight. "The others are saying it's imprinting, like a nesting beast choosing the first thing it sees as its kin. Some think it's dangerous, that you've broken its logic cycle." Jonah let the words hang in the air before responding. "Maybe he's not broken. Maybe he just found someone who didn't try to control him." Vraska sat down across from him. The gesture surprised him. She was always so proud, always moving, always posturing. For her to sit was to admit something unspoken. "I spent 2 years studying neurolinguistic triggers," she said. "Spent months simulating swampland vocal patterns, and you walked in and just scratched his neck?" Jonah tilted his head slightly. I paid attention. She looked at him for a long moment. "You know, they're going to use you now. This isn't a study anymore. You're a variable they can't recreate." Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. She was right. Just then, a comm signal lit up his wristband again. This one wasn't from the faculty. It was a direct override alert from the administration. Jonah accepted the transmission. "Cadet Blake, immediate summon to Observation Deck Alpha. Priority code Crimson 5. Jonah stood at once. Vraska didn't follow, but she didn't look away either. As he walked back down the gravel path toward the elevator shaft, the Academy lights shifted from dusk to night cycle. Shadows elongated across the walls, and the air felt colder than before. When he reached Deck Alpha, the door opened before he touched the pad. Inside, the scene was tense. Professor Eltrick stood beside a high-ranking official in the navy blue insignia of the Council of Sentient Species, a woman with a narrow face, silver hair pulled into tight coils, and a datapad resting on her forearm. Her name tag read Envoy Karen Voltas. Jonah had never seen her before, but he had heard of her. She had overseen first contact with the Vari nest worlds and had written doctrines on cross-sexist territorial trust models. If she was here, this was no longer an academic concern. "Cadet Blake," she said sharply, "I am Envoy Voltaus. You will stand by the display." Jonah complied. The screen lit up with a satellite feed from the Academy's outer wildlife sanctuary. A second Gorvoth had been brought in. This one female. Slightly smaller, scarred across the shoulder, but unmistakably from the same biotype. "This is not a test," Voltas said. "We need to observe if your influence is transferable across subjects. If your interaction pattern functions across individuals, it could redefine interspecies protocol." Professor Elrix folded his hands. "You will enter the containment habitat with the female Gorvoth in 20 minutes. You will wear monitoring implants. You will not initiate contact unless instructed." Jonah's jaw tightened. "She's wild." "We are aware," Voltas replied. "She's shown high aggression since arrival. The male remains passive, but containment with a second is impossible at this stage. We need to determine whether your presence has disrupted the baseline behavior of the species or if it's specific to the male." Jonah stared at the screen. The female Gorvath paced inside the artificial biome, her movements sharp, her shoulders hunched. She swiped at the walls with her claws, leaving deep gashes in the synthetic foliage. He exhaled once, then nodded. "I'll go." The preparation was silent. In the medical wing, 2 technicians attached the implant threads along his spine and wrists, each no thicker than a hair, but capable of measuring hormone fluctuations, stress spikes, muscle tension, even shifts in heart rhythm. He dressed again, buttoned his collar, and walked through the sterilization chamber. He wasn't afraid. He was focused. The doors to the biome parted slowly. The temperature inside was humid, thick with the scent of simulated swamp gas and layered moss. The Gorvath stood at the far end, drinking from a shallow pool. When she saw him, she raised her head abruptly, her eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring. Jonah didn't move forward. He stayed at the edge, back straight, arms at his sides. He made no sound. He let her see him. She circled once, keeping him in her periphery, tail twitching. Her breathing accelerated. She took a step forward, then another. Jonah lowered his posture slowly, just slightly, tilting his head downward to remove direct eye contact. He crouched, not fully, but enough to appear unthreatening. She hesitated. The comm line in his ear buzzed. "Do not engage," Voltass warned. "Observe only." Jonah ignored it. His instincts screamed at him that the female was not responding to silence. She was searching, testing. He slowly reached into the pouch at his side and retrieved a single patch of mossy fiber, a piece from the male's habitat. He laid it gently on the ground and slid it forward with the back of his fingers. The female approached. Slowly. Her claws clicked on the stone. She sniffed the patch. Her posture shifted. Less aggressive. Less rigid. She lifted her gaze to Jonah and made a low, huffing noise. He knew that sound. It was recognition. He moved his hand a few inches and flattened it against the floor. The gesture was simple, unthreatening, familiar. She did not charge. She did not roar. She said. The silence on the comm line was total. Jonah stayed crouched, unmoving. The air was thick. Time slowed. In that stillness, he realized the truth. The Gorvath didn't react to species or biology. They reacted to respect. Not fear, not commands. Respect. Outside the glass, Voltass folded her arms slowly. "Well," she said to Elric's, voice low but clear, "that changes everything." The following days at the Galactic Zoology Academy passed in a way Jonah had never experienced before. It wasn't that the routine had changed. Cadets still trained, professors still lectured, the artificial sunrise still broke over the habitat domes at the same programmed hour. But the way people moved around him had shifted. The glances he received now carried weight, not curiosity. Conversations in corridors quieted when he walked past. He wasn't just a cadet anymore. He had become a variable, one that couldn't be ignored, controlled, or easily replicated. Envoy Karain Voltass remained on campus longer than anticipated. Her presence introduced new security clearances, external observers from the council, and a level of scrutiny that strained the Academy's culture of academic detachment. What had begun as a final exam in behavioral zoology had turned into a case study, one that might redefine the interspecies behavioral protocol used by the Sentient Species Coalition across dozens of planets. Jonah avoided the attention when he could. He still walked the same paths, winding beneath the simulation gardens, down the humidity-controlled corridors near the herbivore research sectors, but his time alone was harder to protect. Whenever he paused to observe the smaller creatures in the observation vaults, someone inevitably found him. Vraska once approached him in the arboretum and sat beside him in silence for almost an hour without saying a word. It was the first time he felt less like a curiosity and more like someone who was simply understood. The council had scheduled a formal debrief. Jonah was called to present his account, not just as a report, but as a verbal deposition. The location was moved from a standard briefing room to the official proceedings chamber on the upper level, a place usually reserved for diplomatic simulations or appeals from senior researchers. He stood before a semicircular table of 8 representatives, 3 from the Academy, 3 from the Council, and 2 independent xenobehavioral analysts. Behind him, a projection of the footage played in silence. The male Gorvath lowering his head into Jonah's palm, then the female sitting after her encounter. The visual was undeniably powerful. No technology, no barrier, just 2 beings and 1 moment of calm. "Cadet Blake," said Counselor Nevre, a tall man with skin like burnished copper and a voice as flat as metal. "We've reviewed the footage. We've analyzed your neurochemical levels. What we cannot measure is the why. Explain to us, how did you do this?" Jonah stood straight. His voice was steady, without arrogance or performance. "I didn't do anything special. I approached them like I would a frightened animal. I didn't treat them as puzzles to solve or systems to override. I treated them like someone who didn't want to be afraid anymore. The counselor narrowed his eyes. So your approach was based entirely on instinct? No, Jonah answered. Instinct guided me, but observation grounded me. I read body language. I waited. I used tone and posture, not just theory. You've spent decades trying to decode alien psychology by isolating variables, but sometimes the missing variable is the one you refuse to acknowledge: relationship. One of the analysts, a woman with soft gray scales along her jawline, leaned forward. Are you implying empathy is the foundation of interspecies behavioral compliance? I'm saying empathy without expectation changes everything, he said. They didn't calm down because I wanted them to. They calmed down because I gave them a choice. Counselor Nevre tapped the table lightly with his ring. We don't build policy around feelings. Maybe that's the problem, Jonah said. The room fell silent. Voltas, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. The implications of your actions are significant. The Coalition has had 43 failed contact missions with high-aggression species in the past 5 cycles. Your method challenges current engagement protocols. Jonah nodded but said nothing. He didn't come here to reform doctrine. He had simply done what he felt was right. Voltas looked to the others. I propose we open a limited-term pilot program, using Cadet Blake's methods under observation, on non-lethal but high-sensitivity species in controlled environments. He will assist, not lead. Let's gather more data before we argue over doctrine. No one opposed her. The motion passed without objection. That evening, Jonah sat beneath the ribbon-frond tree again. The simulated sky was clear, with static stars pinned across a digital void. He had a small recording device in his palm and no idea what to say into it. Not for the council, not for his instructors, but for himself. He activated the mic. Day 7, he began. I'm not sure what this is for, but maybe it matters. I didn't expect this to turn into something political. I didn't want attention. I just didn't want to treat another living being like a project. I grew up with dogs that had been rescued from abuse. Some of them would bite if you even raised your voice. But if you sat still and gave them time, they'd curl up beside you. That's what I saw in the Gorvath, not a threat. A memory of being hunted. He paused, then added, I don't think I'm special. I just think we've forgotten how to see fear without assuming danger. The recording stopped. He sat with the silence, letting it settle in his chest like sediment. After some time, a soft rustling approached, from the gravel path. It was Vraska again. She didn't ask permission. She sat beside him. Tomorrow you meet the advisory team, she said. I know. They'll follow you everywhere. I know that too. She looked at him, the way only someone who's finally set down their own defenses can. You know this is going to change things. Not just for you. For all of us. Jonah let out a soft breath. Maybe that's what scares me. She tilted her head. What scares you more? That it will change, or that it won't? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the sky, even though he knew those stars were artificial, programmed, and empty of real constellations. I think I'm scared of forgetting why I did it in the first place. She leaned back against the tree and closed her eyes. Then, don't. He nodded. 2 days later, Jonah stood once more in the containment dome. But this time, he wasn't alone. A group of young cadets watched from the viewing platform. Behind the glass stood 3 other species, all labeled aggressively reactive, each in their own habitat zone. And in the center stood Jonah. No barrier, no armor, just one man, a notebook, and a breath of silence. He looked at the first creature. He saw the tension in its spine, the twitch in its left flank, the shift in its weight. He crouched low, placed his hand gently on the ground, and waited. No words, no tools, only presence, only choice. The creature looked at him, stepped forward, and did not strike. And in that moment, the story of how humans tamed monsters by scratching behind the ear stopped sounding like folklore and started sounding like the beginning of something new.